Welcome to this Clinical Supervisor Emotional Competence Skill Building Program. I'm Dr. Madeleine Muller. We are currently focusing on the learning environment, and in this particular exercise, we're going to identify the factors that might lead to a toxic work environment. So when we talk about toxic work environments, we quite often also use the word organizational culture. And actually, the organizations in which we train our registrars are very complex because we have the whole educational system. So you have your university and all of those structures that interacts with the health system, so the hospital where you are actually working. And within that, there is obviously the organizational environment that overlaps both of those. And then your educational interaction happening, for example, in an emergency medicine department or in a specific ward or in a specific outpatient department is all within these very intersecting spheres. And there's various factors from these different spheres that's going to contribute to what we then end up calling the organizational culture. When we are talking specifically about a toxic culture, so a culture in which somebody does not feel safe, we will specifically look at underlying unconscious things. And the interesting thing with organizational cultures, it's always driven by people. The organizational culture is not created by exactly how many resources you have or about what is happening in terms of infrastructure, for example. It all has to happen with how people are managing those particular stresses that are happening. So some of the things that we've spoken about in a previous exercises is unconscious biases. So if there's very specific biases within the department against particular groups of people, that's going to feed into that culture. And power dynamics or hierarchical structures automatically leads to specific power dynamics, which may have more or less of an impact depending on your particular department. But very important is the biggest thing that drives culture is how much survival mode there is in the staff on the ground. And that's also why sometimes it can feel like the atmosphere on a ward or on call, for example, can change from night to night, just depending on what team is on the ground. But if you've got very stressed clinical supervisor or you have a very stressed set of nursing or support staff, if there are very stressed registrars, medical officers, interns, or just stressed doctors in other departments you are trying to refer to, all of that is going to lead to the amount of adrenaline running through that system. And then, of course, we can very easily see how that becomes a cycle. So you have somebody in the department, and the higher up they're on the hierarchy, the more power their particular emotion has to actually affect the rest of the workplace. And that person might feel unsafe for some whatever reason, or might just be very stressed. Then we have those negative emotions we spoke about, feeling anxious or irritated or upset. And if one doesn't watch out, one has these counterproductive behaviors that kick in. So that person is either criticizing or preaching or trying to manipulate, or they're ignoring somebody else, or they're feeling sorry for themselves. And this has an effect on another person that they are working with. So if they're, for example, criticizing a colleague, or scoffing or getting sarcastic or being rude, that person now also feels unsafe and gets stressed because of that, triggers within them some strong emotions, and then they might reply with whatever their favorite mechanism is. And that, of course, affects the other person, and round the merry way we go. So very, very simple is if we're talking about toxic spaces, we are always talking about stress and the way the stress leads to certain behaviors that makes people feel more stressed. And so we create this toxic environment within a particular department or place. So that means that if you are a clinical supervisor or you are a leader in a particular setting, you actually want to have some awareness of why your clinicians might be going into survival mode. And there's, of course, many factors that might be driving this. So anybody who's got feeling unsafe in any way is going to potentially flip into survival mode. So if they're being threatened in some way, that includes experiencing verbal abuse. It makes them physically feel unsafe. So if you are shouting at a nurse, for example, that's probably very likely to put her into survival mode. But emotional threat can also make us feel stressed. So when we are rejected, when we are excluded, when people are showing that they don't like us or saying that they don't like us, on a very simple level, that in itself can put somebody in survival mode. But also from a freedom of expression point of view, and this is a little bit when we talked about unconscious biases, for example. So if somebody is being criticized or being attacked for who they are or for how they express themselves, when you humiliate somebody, when you insult somebody, or when you disrespect somebody, that also is a threat to their safety. So that kind of behaviors which is quite often triggered by these counterproductive behaviors, can obviously put people into stress mode. But it's also important to realize that some people are more sensitive to threat than others. And this is very important for me because quite often we find that some people are obviously quite thick-skinned. They, for whatever reasons, are not very much, doesn't go into threat mode very easily. It partly has to do with personality. It partly has to do with their life experiences. Certainly, the more privileged you are, the more likely you are to feel confident and be less likely to be affected by others. But there are people that are much more sensitive to threat and are much more easily going to go into survival mode. And one of the things that we must not do is blame people for being more sensitive to threat and actually not protecting those people. So some people, for example, if you're a more junior member of the staff, so the lower on that hierarchy are, the more likely you are to be vulnerable to be shouted at. So if you're a new intern in a department and somebody's rude to you, you're much more likely to find that very stressful. Personal circumstances, so whatever is happening in that person's life will have a massive impact on how they respond to threat. So if they're having massive fights with their partner at home, if they're going through huge financial stress at that stage, if there's a loved one that is ill and you might be dying, those kinds of circumstances is going to make somebody much more likely to be sensitive. Very important is to consider trauma and abuse history. We do not know what's happened to people. And people might have themselves gone through situations in their childhood or even as an adult where they've experienced trauma of some kind. And this can be triggered by things that might be happening within the workspace. Anybody who's experiencing health issues, whether physical or mental health, if you've got anxiety or depression, that's definitely going to impact. And then also starting to be get inclusive for our neurodiverse colleagues. So if you have somebody who has ADHD or autism, a lot of people with ADHD have RSD, which is a rejection sensitivity dysphoria, extremely sensitive to being criticized and to feeling rejected. And they might also be very sensitive to just a lot of sensory impressions and noise going on. And that might put them into a feeling of being in survival mode much easier. So in this exercise, we merely just want to start observing our own work environments. And I want you to think of a workplace where teaching is taking place. So it can be your outpatient department, it can be a ward, it can be your emergency department. If you're working in several places, think of the workplace with the most challenging one. So maybe a specific ward that you feel is a little bit more challenging. And then I want you to rate it. I want you to think in terms of how supportive, toxic would you say that workplace is. And I want you to look at it from the viewpoint of your junior doctors. So not how toxic you find it, but the little bit of feedback or impression that you got on how your junior doctors are finding your department. So firstly, level 1 is toxic. There's no trust within that department at all. 2 is that it's quite unpleasant and stressful working in that department. Number 3 is it's neutral. It's not awful, but it's not particularly great. Show up, do your job, go home. Level 4 is it's quite pleasant, nice to go to work, get on with everybody, no major conflicts. And 5 is that feeling of awesome teamwork, you know, those evenings when you've been on call and you feel like we've all pulled together and we did amazing stuff. So just notice where you are. Now, you want to think of an overall average in your department. So as I've said, things will go up and down every day, depending on also what's happening in your department. But overall, where would you pitch your department or your particular area from a scale from 1 to 5? And then for this exercise, you're purely going to start exploring what factors do you think are actually what is creating that particular level. So if it's doing quite well, so even 4 or 5, then you can also look at sort of the absence of those particular things. So we're in a department where we've got great diversity and we're very supportive and there is no power dynamics, for example. But yeah, you want to think in terms of what unconscious biases plays in, what kind of power dynamics may or may not play in, and then very look at the stress within that department. So that can simply also be the physical stress. So if you're very understaffed or under-resourced, the emotional relationships between people within that department, but also the individual factors. Do you have particular people within your department that might be much more stressed than average for whatever reasons, and that might be feeding into that particular environment? At the moment, we're not going to talk yet about how we're going to address these, but we're going to start becoming just more conscious of what might be contributing to your toxic work environment. Thank you.